On a bustling street in downtown Atlanta, James Carter, a man in his mid-40s, stood by the curb, exuding quiet authority. His sharp navy suit looked freshly pressed, his polished shoes glinted in the sun, and a red "Make America Great Again" hat perched atop his neatly combed hair. With a briefcase in one hand and a phone in the other, James wrapped up a call about a major corruption case, his bread and butter as the city's chief prosecutor. "Absolutely. I'll have the brief ready by tomorrow," he said, his tone calm and assured, completely oblivious to the chaos brewing behind him. Out of nowhere, a teenager on a skateboard whizzed past, snagging the bright red hat right off James's head. The boy spun dramatically, launched the hat into a muddy puddle with a triumphant flick of his wrist, and shouted over his shoulder, "Nice hat, old man!" before vanishing into the crowded street. James blinked, momentarily stunned. He stared at the floating hat as if it were a sinking ship. "Really?" he muttered, more to himself than anyone else. Taking a deep breath, he scanned the area for help and spotted salvation. A police officer lounging near a coffee cart, nursing an oversized latte. Relief spread across James's face as he approached. "Officer," he began, his tone calm but firm. "A kid just swiped my hat and tossed it into that puddle. Can you help me find him?" The officer, a young man with a crisp uniform and a name tag that read Steve, gave the floating hat a disdainful glance. His face twisted in mild disgust, as though James had asked him to fish out a dead rat. "Let me stop you right there," Steve said, folding his arms and balancing his coffee like it was more important than his badge. "Next time, think twice about wearing something so provocative. People around here don't need that kind of negativity." James raised an eyebrow, his lawyer instincts kicking in. "Provocative? It's just a hat." Steve let out a snort, the kind reserved for people you've already decided are beneath you. "Just a hat? That thing screams division and hatred. I'm not wasting my time over it." James blinked. "You're serious?" "Dead serious," Steve said, taking a long, dramatic sip of his coffee. "We don't need people like you stirring the pot." James opened his mouth, then closed it, his usual sharp wit failing him for once. Around them, pedestrians paused, throwing James judgmental side-eyes or smirking as though he'd just gotten a taste of poetic justice. A kid on a scooter even shouted, "Nice puddle!" before darting away. James exhaled slowly, the image of calm professionalism, and stepped into the puddle to retrieve the hat. He flicked off the water and looked at Steve, his expression unreadable. "Noted, officer," he said evenly. "Thanks for your service." Steve's smirk widened, clearly mistaking James's restraint for defeat. But James just turned, holding the dripping hat, and walked away with the quiet confidence of someone who knows exactly how this story ends. The incident gnawed at James as he walked home. As the city's chief prosecutor, he was used to tension, even outright hostility. But being dismissed by a police officer? That was new. Still, James Carter wasn't the type to let petty irritations derail him. He had bigger fish to fry. A sprawling corruption case involving several city officials, one that had kept him awake for weeks. And yet, as much as he tried to focus on the case, the officer's smug face and disdainful tone kept replaying in his mind. The next morning, James strode into the courthouse early, his polished shoes echoing against the marble floors. His briefcase swung lightly at his side, and perched on his head was a brand new MAGA hat, bold and unapologetic. It wasn't just a hat now, it was a statement. As he stepped through security, the familiar voice of Officer Steve carried through the grand hall. He was leaning casually against a pillar near the courthouse entrance, chatting animatedly with a colleague. "And then this guy in a MAGA hat expects me to be his personal fashion police," Steve said, his voice loud enough to carry. He laughed, clearly amused with himself. "I mean, come on. I don't have time to worry about some dumb hat." James stopped mid-step, his expression unreadable. The corners of his mouth twitched as he realized Steve hadn't recognized him the night before, and judging by his tone, he still didn't. Nearby courthouse staffers glanced at James, then at Steve, their faces lighting up with suppressed laughter. The absurdity of the situation was impossible to miss. James let it play out a moment longer, savoring the irony. Finally, with an easy smile, he approached. "Good morning, officer," James said, his voice calm but loaded with quiet authority. Steve turned, his confident smirk evaporating as recognition washed over him. His face went pale. "Oh, morning, sir." James's smile didn't waver. "I see you're busy," he continued smoothly. "But I'd love a moment to discuss public accountability. It's one of my passions." Steve muttered something unintelligible, his hand twitching toward his coffee, as though it might save him. The staff nearby exchanged knowing glances, their poorly hidden grins adding fuel to the tension. As Steve mumbled an excuse and retreated hastily toward the exit, James stood there, his new hat gleaming in the morning sun. With a slight chuckle, he turned to a staffer and quipped, "Accountability. It's a tough hat to wear." That afternoon, the city council chambers were packed for a highly anticipated corruption hearing. Journalists, local leaders, and citizens crowded the room, all eager to hear the prosecutor's opening remarks. Officer Steve had been assigned to provide security for the event and stood at the back of the room, scanning the crowd. When James entered, the room fell silent. His presence commanded attention. Dressed in a sleek suit and, to Steve's horror, the same MAGA hat from the previous day, James approached the podium with measured steps. "Good afternoon," James began, his voice resonating across the chamber. "Before we begin, I'd like to thank everyone for being here today. Accountability is the cornerstone of justice, and it's my job to ensure no one, no matter their title, is above the law." As James spoke, Steve's face turned ghostly pale. The realization hit him like a freight train. The man he'd dismissed, insulted, and publicly ridiculed was the city's top prosecutor, the man responsible for holding powerful figures accountable. "Now," James continued, his eyes sweeping the room, "accountability doesn't just apply to those in this chamber. It extends to every corner of our city, including those sworn to serve and protect." Steve's heart sank as James's gaze lingered on him briefly before moving on. Several people in the room, aware of the morning's events, shot glances at the officer, who looked ready to crawl under his chair. After the hearing, James stepped outside to address a crowd of reporters. Questions flew at him, many about the case, but a few curious about his choice of headwear. "I wear this hat," James said with a wry smile, "because it reminds me that justice doesn't discriminate. It doesn't care what you wear, who you voted for, or where you're from. Everyone deserves fairness under the law." As he wrapped up, James noticed Steve lingering on the edge of the crowd, looking miserable. James approached him, his expression unreadable. "Officer," James said, his tone neutral, "I believe we've met." Steve nodded, words failing him. James leaned in slightly, lowering his voice. "Next time, remember, your badge isn't a shield for bias. It's a promise to serve everyone equally. I trust you won't forget that." Steve swallowed hard. "I won't, sir. I'm sorry." James clapped him on the shoulder and walked away, leaving the officer to reflect on his actions. By evening, social media was abuzz with videos of James's speech and his pointed message about equality. Comments ranged from praise to heated debates, but one thing was clear. James had turned an unpleasant moment into a teachable one, showing the power of calm, confident leadership. As for Steve, he became the poster child for departmental training on implicit bias, a small but lasting reminder that actions, no matter how small, have consequences.